she organized it. It's her idea.
Okay.
I'll talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon on the operativity of history and theory. So, thank you to the speakers that I will introduce briefly in a minute. Thank you to Barbara Elfman, who's been, as usual, very helpful in putting together this event. And a special thank to Marika, because although this event comes immediately before the Cambridge talks, this is not the Cambridge talks, but Marika has nevertheless been very helpful to putting together this additional event. So this event is part of the activity of this curious institution in the school that we call platforms. I'm still trying to figure out what is a platform, but we have a platform in history theory that I currently chair, the mission of which is, as far as I've understood, to try to promote some kind of disciplinary coordination and perspective. So, and this is a little bit what we've tried to do, which is to have regular conversation about, what is the present state of history and theory, where are we going, what's the place in design education, etc., etc. So we're going to deal with operativity today, and I know that Michael is going to introduce it. So I won't be long. I just wanted, again, to thank our speakers and to introduce them very briefly. So Michael Hayes, Elliot Noyes Professor of Theory here, so, but he's also doing history. He is academic dean, co-chair of the PhD and DDes program with me, and above all, a prolific author on contemporary theory. He's written a lot about the autonomy project in the 1970s and other issues that are important for the understanding of contemporary architecture. Martin Bressani will be very simple. He's one of my favorite historians. He teaches at McGill, has been preparing for a certain amount of time a book on
non-prolific.
But nevertheless precious historian. And I'm hoping in a few months to be able to finally read his comprehensive Summa on Viollet-le-Duc. Martin has been especially working on 19th century French theory of and practice of architecture. Eran Neuman, next to me, is actually, what's the name? Head of the School of Architecture of the University of Tel Aviv. Eran studied architecture, did a PhD at UCLA, and has been working on a number of issues. Part of his work, I would say, is on the digital. The other part is on issues of monumentality, memory, etc. And his most recent book is about this issue. And finally, John May, who is currently assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I knew John actually almost from the GSD. And then when he took a PhD in geography at the university at UCLA, there again, you two have that in common, but in geography. And John has been one of the sharpest critiques of some contemporary technological trends, so this is why he's here today. We've asked, Michael is going to give a brief overall reflection on theory, operativity, etc. Then our three speakers, Martin will be addressing more the issue of studio culture, history and theory. Eran?
Not at all.
Not at all. It doesn't matter.
Sorry.
It doesn't matter. So, well, it will be what it will be.
Sorry, I didn't know it was my mandate. So.
Okay.
But we can discuss it again.
Well, it doesn't matter. We'll survive. Well, yeah, we have that in email. Don't worry. We'll prove it to you afterward. So, Marin will be creative. Eran will be also extremely creative. And same with John. So, Michael.
So I thought it would be helpful to have the operative definition of operativity on the screen, at least for a while, though I'm not going to, I won't address it directly, I'll come back to it later. Which of course Manfredo Fouris. I was thinking about questions, how do you think in the present about architecture in the past, and how do you make or refuse to make that operative? And I realized that philosophically, questions about architecture in the present together with architecture's past is very like questions about the self. For example, how do I...
Cell phone. Touch the microphone.
How, yeah, well, but the cell phone has the timer, and so... You got me? You got me? Okay. Give me 10. A signal, okay. So how does who I am now relate to who I was before? This is the nature of the questions today, I think. How do I know whether I can apply the same kind of interpretations or appraisals to the two different conditions? As William James asked, what does the consciousness mean when it calls the present self, or the present architecture, the same with one of the past selves, with one of the past selves which it has in mind? Now the point of that last, I think, is very important, that as in thinking about the self, so in thinking about architecture history, we don't consider the present to be simply and inevitably a continuation of the past. A past that in turn, on that model, would only function to provide an assurance of an ongoing identity. That would be a very conservative position. The present is rather a condition that's precipitated through sort of almost the contingent actualization of a huge multiple number of connections among events of all sorts, which have presumably in that contingency released new powers to act in ways different than we acted before. So present is kind of constantly being made out of multiple vectors that come from the past. So as in thinking about the self, so with thinking about architecture's history, do we face the necessary, I guess, contradiction, or I would rather say dialectic, that in order for architecture's history to be relevant for us in the present, we must grasp it as irretrievably past. And this is what I want to explore very, very quickly and briefly. I want to suggest that one way to achieve the construction of architecture as past in order that it can be relevant in the present is by writing history as narrative. I want to talk about briefly three moments or three turns of narrative. First of all, that the past, that was my punchline. The idea of Chronos, Chronos here in the guise of Saturn. Every time a child would be born, that is to say, every time a possible future would arise, Chronos eats it. So history absorbs the possible futures. This is what we want to try to deal with. Three moments in narrative. First of all, the past is not constructed should not be constructed by us, I think, as some relationship between some individual and some isolated cultural artifact. Most architectural history is written. Viewers encounter objects, subjects encounter objects. But I would like to say that we should rather write the past as interactions of collective social structures or forms. I'm giving you just an unexplained, this is something Erica and I use in our course on the Renaissance and the Baroque, the way we talk about a kind of expanded field where certain conditions that are resolved by the classical, like the idea of an antique, like the logic of perspective, the idea of elemental parts and objects, and resolve that contradiction in what's called the classical. And that out of those same original conditions, they spin off their opposites, which is rather than having a single logic of vision, you have multiple logics of vision. Rather than having an original antique, you have the idea of innovation. Rather than elemental parts, you have the opposite idea of totality, et cetera, et cetera. And then the resolution of that contradiction is the Baroque itself. I mean, it's kind of this takes us a turn, okay, so give me a break, but we can actually show that somehow the Baroque is in a way latent in the Renaissance. But more, and this is even more interesting, is that these side logics also have their own versions, as in sort of Sansovino's, is this Sansovino, Erica?
Da Sangallo.
So Da Sangallo is in Sangallo's project for or Peruzzi's plan for a temple, or in some of Michelangelo's work, you get these kind of proleptic Baroques that emerge almost inevitably, if you will, out of the same field. So what I'm saying is, rather than construct the past as individuals encountering objects, we should construct the past as structures, and these would be social structures as well as aesthetic structures. Now this move enables a second move, which is now a kind of regrounding of history, such that now history kind of takes on an urgency of the past, in the sense, just like as we move from Renaissance to Baroque, for the Baroque, the past itself, or for us, the past itself begins to come before us, as it were, as a radically different life form, as a self on its own, which rises up to call our own life world into question. So the reason for doing history in this sense is history shows us differences from ourselves, right? History is different from us. It rises up to challenge us. And if you have those two conditions, then the third, and you see how in a way one follows from the other, that finally, insofar as any mode of production, we now have the idea of a kind of mode of production moving through from past to present, then it follows at least the possibility for articulating some future. I would even say of the possibility of some utopian impulse that arises out of this condition, where we see the present as being challenged by the past, then we can see the present as also a past for some imaginable future. So we actually get a kind of future enabled out of this. Let me just quickly come to a little expand this idea of narrative. That narrative, I think, is actually a precondition of dialectical thinking, and I don't have time to argue for dialectics, except to say that I think they're still useful, if not necessary. And what I mean by that is that narrative entails some kind of, a certain kind of closure, at least insofar as closure is one of the hallmarks of dialectical thinking. It comes from Hegel's admonition that the owl of Minerva takes flight only at dusk, which is to say that what we're theorizing, what we're describing as history, must have already taken place. It must have already ended. The story we want to tell, the narrative we want to construct, must have already ended in order for this work, this model to work. So the historian, in a way, should tell of the necessity of the event. Really, the history I'm asking that we write tells why things had to happen that way, and then only, in this way and only in that way does architecture itself become an active agent in history. Let me try it this way. If we think of, and this would be the second kind of point, that within the framework of the past as a structure, the writing of history as narrative would be thought of as taking place in a series of sort of cascading levels, or better, of kind of widening context. And in this, the first, and I'm sorry, it's not as sharp as I had hoped. At the first level, that we can think of our object as more or less a single building, or a form and a concept, a kind of building as a sign. But very quickly we would say that the surround of that single object or event or project or situation or whatever, the surround of that would be something like the material conditions of practice. And by material conditions, I would include concepts as part of that material condition, and also what Althusser might call the problematic, or what Foucault called an episteme. That a theory and a practice would be the surround of that. And then the conditions of possibility for that theory and that practice is what we would call ideology, and that is the next level of concern for the historian. And ideology is itself nothing more, nothing less than a representation of the social formation itself. And then all of this is propelled, if you will, by this absent, unrepresentable thing we call history. That the social formation is just a representation of history. Ideology is a representation of the social formation. The episteme is conditions of possibility that make practice possible, which produces architecture. So this is cascading. I will go very, very quickly. I do want to insist that such a model is dependent on a perspective that reads the work of architecture against a situation that is constructed as embodying or as containing contradictions, so that the historian then has the ability to interpret the work of architecture, if you will, as a kind of solution to the contradiction. That is to say that the object of architecture, in its representational function, addresses a social contradiction as an active agent rather than just being an inert object. I have to go so fast that I won't be able to make full sense of this, but I think there's another kind of structure. If you know hymns, we can be quick with this, that you take this sort of form and content structure that I was working with, but you realize it's not a simple binary, that you can have the form of form, the content of form, the form of content, and the content of content. This is straight semiotics for those of you who know them. And what I want to suggest is that this kind of structure would allow us to construct something like the modalities of narrative. First would be what we would call the content of content, and very quickly, the content of content is another name for social history. That is to say, you talk about when Pope Leo travels from Rome into Florence on his way to Bologna, and you talk about the events of finishing the facade, putting up a false facade for the cathedral, for the Duomo, and you talk about all that, but you don't talk about the painting as a painting, right? This is the content of content. It's social history, completely ignoring the form or the painting as a painting. That would be one modality of narrative. The other would then be the form of content. And for example, this is Tafuri, I won't go through it, but this is Tafuri talking about Sansovino's sort of canvas facade, very flat facade for the Duomo on the occasion of Pope Leo, but he's reading it as almost like a pure, almost an unmediated, uncontested representation. Or maybe a better example, if those of you who know Robin Evans' work on villas, the way he describes the form of the villa as an almost direct representation of the social content, the social activities of the villa. So that, and then the form of form, that's very, very easy for any architect. It's Wittkover on Alberti, it's Wittkover on Palladio, it's Collinrow on Le Corbusier and Palladio together. So that's taking the form of form where content almost drops away. It's formalism. But the most interesting one, of course, and it's the one I'll leave you with, is the content. Oh, and when Gideon, can compare Cotlin to Borromini, it would be form of form. The content of form, it seems to me, is actually not just a fourth, but rather it somehow is the moment that allows all the others in some way. It's the only perspective from which a kind of dialectical reversal takes place, and that you can actually read. I do have to quote Tafuri. The rigorous syntax of the project has all the earmarks of a manifesto, that the architecture itself is like a manifesto, that the architecture itself addresses the situation. The architecture is a declaration of principle. So he's reading here the content of the form rather than the form of the content. So, to write history is not, I say, just to make attributions, confirm facts, or operatively to find relevant guides for present design. The operativity of history is when historian uses history to try to describe really historical dynamics and even the laws of historical dynamics that govern changes in social formations, and how architecture, in a general sense, look at that, 15 minutes, that architecture in the most general sense represents actively those social formations thinking. So I'm hoping that might provide some little, some maybe tools or at least vocabulary ways of thinking about more generally. Do I pass it now to?
Yes,
yes.
Thank you very much, Michael. The way we're going to organize it, we're going to have now Martin and then a conversation, and then the other two, and each time with a conversation. So,
Oh, really?
Martin?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, well, should I use the mic or?
Yes.
Yes, okay. First, I want to thank America and the ghostly presence of Peter, which I saw. Hi, Peter. And of course, thanking Antoine and Michael to put up this event. I have to say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had to talk about studio and history.
Doesn't matter. We'll adapt.
No, but we can talk about it. In fact, in some ways, I'm thinking that actually what I have to say may lead to some interesting discussion about that issue. I do teach studio, and I'm an historian, so I've practiced both these things. I've always separated them quite radically. I've for some reason, going to the classroom and teaching a class in history for me has always been radically different than going in studio and working on project with students. And I'm actually, I think now, getting ready to go back and bring history to studio. So there might be a shift here, and maybe what I have to say here can shed light on that. It was interesting to hear Michael's comments, because I actually was interested in your comment about the way it relates to the self, how history should relate to self, and I guess the notion of narrative would make that clear insofar as we organize our lives and make sense of our lives in a narrative fashion. And part of my point will be, will include that, I think, that aspect as a subset. Michael, could you go back to,
I can, yeah, which one do you want, the Tafori?
No, not the Tafuri one, actually your big diagram. It's not,
No,
I just was taken by the shadow.
I like to show it.
Okay.
I like history as a big dark stain on the ground.
That's the part I'm interested in.
That one I really like a pool of blood.
Yeah. Well, that is a bit my point right there, this dark part. I'm going to start by, so I've just jotted some ideas this morning. One of the reasons why I may not be attentive to Marika's instruction was that I was preparing 2 talks back to back. I'm also talking tomorrow, and I must say I spent more time preparing that one for tomorrow's colloquium. And this is just a fairly cursory set of ideas.
That's the plan.
Yeah, okay, good. So I'm starting with a very general statement about architecture in general, and I'd just like to say, as a blanket statement, that I think we could say that architecture is a historical art, particularly if we compare it to the other imitative art. Since architecture is not, at least in its traditional frame, is not imitating anything but itself, it has inherently the task to consider its own history. So I think traditionally the building of the monument was commemorative. It was making the past present. So I think we can talk about, the great figures of architectural history, like the pyramids, the Doric temple, the Gothic cathedral. All of these productions really were a series of imitation of themselves. So the pyramid imitated another pyramid, the Doric temple imitated another Doric temple, the Gothic cathedral imitated another Gothic cathedral, and they all, in some ways, I'm not, really current on the current scholarship on these particular structure, but the pyramid made reference to some kind of primordial structure, probably some sacrificial mound. The Doric temple, as we know from Vitruvius, was related to some primitive wooden temple, and the Gothic cathedral, if we trust Abbé Suger, was the Temple of Jerusalem, so that there was inherent in the architectural activity a relation to the past. So that architecture, that's been said over and over, this is quite not very original statement, reenacts an original moment. We can refer to Semper, for instance, who's elaborated a great deal on this. saying, for instance, that the monument is the festive apparatus made permanent. But you could, instead of saying that architecture imitates itself, which could have a tendency to lock ourselves in some kind of autonomous realm, you could say that architecture is involved in an act of repetition, and perhaps an act of repetition in a psychoanalytical sense. The constant reenactment of a primal scene, so primal scene being this Freudian term. So I think history, you could say, is profoundly inscribed in architecture's gene, just like each of our own childhood is inscribed in our own subconscious. That's why the darkness interested me. This is perhaps true of every art form. Doing painting is always in relation to the history of painting in some ways, but I think it is a particularly explicit structure of architecture's operation. It's culture's own reenactment. Now, pyramids, dark temples, and cathedrals may seem completely irrelevant reference for our present situation. The sense of our own contemporariness is so pressing and so overwhelming that history seems really something we've left out. I mean, the sense that I was trained as an historian in the 80s, and we really had a sense that we had left, history was something we had left behind somehow, that it was completely irretrievable. And so, and I think that this feeling of the radicality of the present is of course embedded in what it means to be modern. And in architecture, of course, Corbusier is of the 1920s, super studios of the 60s, and the current digital guys, or girls as well, of the 90s, we are just so overwhelmed by current conditions that, the idea that you would actually refer to any history doesn't seem to make sense at all. So killing the father, tabula rasa, as no past seemed capable to survive in the radicality and newness of the present. Yet evoking the past is probably one of the key methods to deal with the radically new, of course. In his 18 Brumaire, Karl Marx has noted the fact that the French revolutionaries of 1789 performed their task of their time, as he says, and I quote directly, in Roman costumes and with Roman phrases. The overwhelming newness of the situation requires some form of mediation. It required some significant structure to give it form. So there's a kind of costume drama. And then for Marx, that was somewhat critical. I mean, it was a temporary stage that was required, but it's something that eventually had to be overcome, this costuming. But we could say that it also points to the fact that history is always a repetition, and particularly in its revolutionary moments. Now, I wanted to give an architectural example of this, and I actually thought I should perhaps show pictures, but then I chose such a famous building that I don't need to show pictures of it. So the London Parliament building, designed by Baron Pugin in the late 1830s, is a good example of using historical garbs to deal with the present. So England in the 1830s and 40s, of course, is the center of one of the most radical revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And architecture is particularly important because it involves a profound transformation of the material world. So the Industrial Revolution is really a new landscape that emerges, and of course emerges particularly in London. And by the 1830s and 40s, of course, London, the phenomenon of the metropolis is quite clear in London. England is, of course, the first capitalist economy and was at the apex of that development. So the London Parliament, of course, is a revivalist building. You all know the building. Reenacts two past, which is juxtaposed. The one which is the most obvious is the medieval past. Gothic revival building, that's the usual classification. And of course, one that I would argue, this is maybe not as clear, but it also, I think, makes a fairly obvious, though somewhat below threshold of awareness, reference to the Palace of Versailles. So it's the Palace of Westminster, and it has this long horizontality, has no roof, etc. It's reflected on the Thames. All of these things were really very strong characteristic of Versailles, which of course was the European greatest powerhouse. So it seems normal that Barry would want to make a reference to absolutist power. So in some ways, you could say Versailles is a kind of interesting mix in that building, which is, I think, one of the greatest modern buildings that were built, because it fuses those two very nicely, and one is the absolutism of power, the other one is, of course, the Gothic, which is, you could say, the British liberties, it's the Magna Carta, so the British refer to their own history and overlays on top of Versailles, and therefore it says that the British took over France, and that's a very, I think it could be narratively discussed. So history is operative here, not simply in the sense of giving a symbolic form to the new, as a sort of reaction to an incapacity to confront the new. So it's not, I don't think it's only escapism, but a reenactment of a primal scene. A primal British scene, the Gothic, and a primal absolutist scene, Versailles. So the Gothic in France, I would say, and I use the word haunting presence. So I think it's a the Gothic in England, you could say, yes, it's British liberties, there's a whole discourse about that. So it refers to a certain idea of that the British had of themselves, but the Gothic is much more than that. The Gothic by 1840s, thanks in large measure to the Gothic novel, is a much more complex set of references. And France, of course, coming out of the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, all of those things that England is trying to put at bay, also has a certain sense, you could say, that it's a return of the repressed, and that they are actually trying to deal and operate on that haunting reference, which is France. So the London Parliament is, I would say, a splendid expression of desire. And in some ways, that's what I'd like to say, that history can be a tool, that we should actually perhaps discuss history in terms of in a discourse of desire. And desire, arguably, is always fundamentally about the resurgence of the past and the present. You want to possess something that is lost. So I'm kind of following in Michael's thing that, yes, the past is always irretrievably lost, but it returns. So bring the debate on the role of history in architecture to a discourse on desire rather than on a question of legitimacy, which maybe is what Tafshiri had in mind in talking about operative history, that you legitimate modern practice by making a sort of genealogy of it. So as we speak, and this is a note, as we speak, architects across the world are busy designing revivalist building, as you probably know, not just the Prince Charles, but there's a very wide historicist practice. It's very active. Bob Stern, I'm not sure if he still does it, but he does these splendid shingle-style mentions on Long Island.
It's not so far from here.
So I expected the laughter, but I believe it's wrong to dismiss entirely such phenomena as simply irrelevant pastiche. The architecture may not be very satisfying. It may be vulgar. It may be crude. It may be incoherent in its historical metaphors. It's unidimensional, whatever. Would agree with that in many cases. But it is the expression of profound desire, not just of escape, but for an imaginary substance. A living in fiction, I would say, which I believe is a fundamental need of any cultural existence. I've been interested in the Gothic novel, how architecture, usually in the form of old castles and abbeys and crypts and dark corridors. So in the Gothic novel, architecture serves to project the reader in an absorptive, immersive experience. Often it helps to talk about experience of dread and eroticism. And it has been said that the Gothic novel is a precursor of psychoanalysis, the return of the dead, or the return of the repressed, so the vampire figure, or the undead, which I like as an expression, the doubling also, the hunted. These are terms that are couched in a structure of desire and in terms of historical reenactment. And somehow architecture stands at the center of that. So in light of the current emotive turn in social sciences, in other words, the return of passions and emotions in cognitive science that we're witnessing today, the recognition of effect as the material substance of our lives, that we actually navigate the world effectively. And I think that's more and more the case. I think we do that more and more. So the idea, like Foucault saying, that we actually live, we're compartmented in social roles. I think we could say that today we're more and more living effectively. We map ourselves through effective alliances, and we, with social networks and things like that. So within this new development, history may become operative again in architecture as the only imaginary substance capable of generating significant emotions in response to deep-seated desires. So current interest in the emotive and the affective in architecture has used reference to contemporary art mostly, the work of Yassin, for instance, with light effects and a lot of fog. But I'm wondering if we would not fare better if through the return of the Gothic and the Enchanted and the Baroque, and instead of only playing with light and fog. Movie production, I think movies use historical reenactment. I think it's fundamental to movie making today. I saw last week Melancholia by the German von Trotter was his name. Yeah. And I actually like that movie a lot. And of course, it was very attuned to the production of the effective. It's a story of basically it's a very cosmic movie, of course, and it's set in a Denmark mansion. So it's set in a very historical. So it's a very kind of sense of contemporariness and historical, and I think it does generate a certain particular angst and effectiveness. And I'm thinking also of 2001, Space Odyssey, is an old movie, but the last scene where period furniture appears in the middle of this absolutely radically new space. And we could say the same of the Olivetti lobby that Sterling, when Sterling put, famous moment of postmodernism when he put these period furniture in the middle of this, again, radically new space. So I could only find a French word, fantomisation de la réalité historique. So fantomisation, I don't know how we say that. Phantomization. Okay. So the phantomization of historical reality may be a way to make it operative. So I throw at the table for discussion the concept that Freud's concept of repetition and Derrida's concept of the haunted may be an interesting way to make history operative. So I just end on this note.
Thank you, Martin. I probably start with a question and then open to the floor. I was really struck by your House of Parliament, and I was thinking, at the time the Gothic was clearly the undead.
Yes.
And I was also struck by what you said about cinema. You could have added video games, which are great consumer of heroic fantasy kind of, and I would say that in my video game, probably Gothic is a kind of undead thing.
Yes.
But what is undead in architecture today? You see what I mean? In all these parametric, etc. Where do we touch something that is undead? Would be a very practical question for me. Would it be the Baroque, for example? It seems to me sometimes that we may actually find the Renaissance, the Baroque, less undead than modernity. I don't know. I'm asking.
What about Loos's Doric column? Well, I mean, I think that's. I wouldn't know how to answer this. In fact, I think that's something that we may construct that would be related to cultural situations, so that I mean, just like the Gothic, obviously for the British in 1830 had a certain presence, with something that we would have to work with and investigate. I think it's interesting. The classical, of course, is the undead in a way. The classical column. I mean, it's this thing that never dies. Maybe that's something that it's funny to talk about the undead in terms of the classical because it doesn't have quite the same resonance as the Gothic. I think it's a good question. I don't know what to answer to that.
Yes, Michael, and
How much can I talk?
no, you cannot talk long. It's a reaction.
No. I think the classical column was the undead of the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
I think now the undead is maybe something like perspective insofar as we think about the non-perspectival buildings. Scott Cohen just had an exhibition before this one of the museum in Tel Aviv, which is a very non-perspectival, and yet there's something of, I'm thinking about the distorted, warped, sort of parametrically designed things that we see. They desperately, they've lost the ability to believe in perspective, and yet perspective is still the object of desire that is no longer achievable. So something more like perspective in the color.
Yeah,
That's
that's right.
interesting. That might be true. Geometry might be.
Yeah.
I would venture another take on this, which might be that at least in third world countries, which is where I come from, it's very customary for designers to craft their vision in terms of imitation and reproduction of what has been going on in Europe or in the States or the latest in Dubai, and it's always this aspirational fantasy to compete with the uncompetable. The interesting thing is that these images are exported in bidimensional form. And so in a way, it is the return of the subplan, as it were, and of this congealed image that becomes completely hypostasized and that emerges in extremely bizarre ways when actually rebuilt in different contexts.
You can have the frozen undead.
Yeah.
Yes, Erika?
This is a question for both Michael and Martin. And I'm just interested in the way that you think architecture, in particular, narrativizes. This comes from an anecdote. It's a friend of mine who now teaches at Chicago, who's an historian, and went to a job interview. And the first question was, could you offer a definition of historicism, historiography, historicity, and history? And I'd like to simply to think about the ways in which those narratives have affected architecture. If we think of, say, historiography as the picking up of event and matching the different ideologies that fuel the retelling of a particular event. If we want to see historicity in qualitative terms, perhaps. If we want to see historicism as signaling a particular moment in the 80s or 70s that have to do with a methodological change, with new historicism itself. And I'm curious about the choices we make as we narrativize the return of the dead. Martin, you started with deep history, a kind of mythology, in fact. So I'm just curious.
Well, one book that would be interesting to write would be the history of revivals in architecture. You might be surprised that, in fact, it's pretty much the rule of how architecture is operated, except in maybe some eclipse, and even, of course, you can always find haunted presence in Corbusier's rat villas of the 20s, for instance, and things like that, which seem to be so about rupturing from history. You can always find other source. But in a more common sense term, I think the revivalism is for me an inherent phenomenon of architecture. There's very fascinating micro revival, like when Louis XV revives Versailles, Louis XIV. It's like we're talking about the space of 50 years where he quotes and redoes the thing to actually reassert certain things. There's micro level revivals in architecture and big revivals, the Renaissance. The Baroque also is a form of revivalism if you see it as a return of the Gothic and other things of that sort. And of course, the 19th century. So it'd be interesting to make a history that way, where the revival would be actually the common mode of architecture. So coming back to my sense that architecture imitates itself, really, that it's always about bringing a site that's gone. And that's what we do as architects. And my point really is that is very powerful, that it really works. So if I go in Mont-Tremblant and north of Montreal and they do a little Alpen Village reproduction mock-up copy that's being done, it's done well, it works, it really works. It really works. I mean, in terms of the emotive, it's
terrifying at the same time.
Yes, maybe because it's not very subtle, it's unidimensional, it doesn't have that complexity which appeals to us. But I remember in studio when I was working in the 70s when, the postmodern, because I was trained just when that was coming out. And it was an incredibly powerful thing to be able to do that suddenly. It kind of, so I'm not interested in the problem of symbolism and meaning. It was just simply your architecture suddenly could do something that it didn't do before. So if we think effectively about buildings, we might just have to look at history in some ways but it has to be narratively engaged in the sense that it has to be compelling and multidimensional and something that really is satisfying for. So I think the London Parliament is a very complex building because it's at once an office building. It looks like the Seagram building on its side, and it anticipates the Crystal Palace, but yet it's Versailles, it's the Goth. I mean, it's able to do something which has made London, really. You know, it's one of those mythic structures that has made a city. And I think it is narratively, something narratively given. I'm not sure, Michael, if you were saying that you think we should do narrative histories?
Yes.
In a very concrete way? Like telling stories?
Certain sorts of stories, yeah. Yeah. I mean, but where the narrative has structure, which is a narrative not about some autonomous agent called the architect that can cause change individually, but rather where the characters are themselves effects of the structure. You know, in a way that the 19th century novel, like Henry James, the way that the characters are actually, genre figures that emerge from the structure itself. That kind of narrative, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the novel is interesting as a structure because it, this is like the Bakhtin's point that it brings different characters, different voices together. It's pluridimensional. This notion of plurissimi at once rather than a unilateral kind of.
I have to say that this morning I asked in the building text and context who had ever read a James novel.
Henry James.
Henry James, and I think I got 2 or 3 people.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. That we're so far, we're tackling very much. I do believe actually that, for example, literature could be a mode of entry into probably reframing the question of the new, but we're very far right now.
Yeah, interesting.
In some ways. Just one. Yeah, Marika?
Marty, you said that, I think I wrote this down right, you said that living in fiction is a fundamental element of any cultural resistance?
Yeah, I think that we need to, in order to playfully relate to our culture, culture is something imposed on us, the burden, it's the real, not in a Lacanian sense, but it's the thing we live in. And the idea that we need to live in fiction, I think it's fundamental for cultural existence, that we can actually think of alternative worlds. We need to, that's what I think architecture provides, is an aesthetic moment. It's an aesthetic moment where we live alternative ways. And I think that's essential for the sanity and the health of cultural, so in that sense I find that in the digital discourse, it tends to fall in the fallacy of the technological development where we must do, this notion that it doesn't give that space of the necessary arbitrariness anybody working in studio knows how arbitrary architecture is. And in some ways maybe the digital guys confront that more than any other because they can just do anything. But it's not taking charge, the idea that we create illusions, that we're creating fiction houses, that we're world makers. I think that's something that's been lost a little bit, and that's one thing that I like about the affective argument is that it brings that dimension back.
So my question was,
Sorry.
no, my question was,
I thought that was your question.
this goes back to the idea of teaching and specifically teaching studio.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of pedagogical importance to not simply the notion that one way to resist, or perhaps the only way to resist, is fiction, living in fiction, but rather the fact that architects can help create the narrative of fiction? Is there a process, is there a fictional process that we can teach? How does one create worlds that don't exist? How does one instantiate projection?
How does one create walls that don't exist?
Worlds.
That what you just
Worlds.
said? Worlds that don't exist? Well, that's what we do as architects. We create interiors, right? So, architects about boundary. I mean, I know there's the landscape. I'll talk about that tomorrow. About the idea that we, merge with the landscape and everything's continuous and topographical, in the sense that wants to deny the figure-ground relationship. We may play with that. It's fine. I'm very interested in that myself. But I think irreducibly we're creating worlds. So I think that's what the task of the architect is fundamentally, isn't it? That the building is a world-building event. Even if that world-building, like talk about brutalism, where it's about returning ourselves to the very world in which we live, where the fiction is about representing what is there rather than some magically alternative one, the haunted house. But for me, I work with atmosphere a lot in my studios, and as I'm developing this notion of an atmosphere, and again, I'll talk about that tomorrow a little bit, the notion that architecture becomes a media, I've repressed historical references, and I've been looking a lot and reading psychology, neurobiology. I'm interested in the definition of emotion that's current, and I think that's a lot of people are interested in that now. But in the end, I find that the historical material is so potent, but I don't have a recipe. If that's what you're asking me in terms of how that would, in terms of process, how would that be actually taught and brought to the students?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I suppose for me, I look at architecture, I appreciate it as the power that it has, the aesthetic power that it has as objects, but I'm also interested in architecture as a process, as a series of procedures. And so I'm wondering if there's another level or another dimension, almost a depth to this notion of fiction.
What is that?
That exists at the level of practice, not merely at the surface of the object.
One thing that just to answer this quickly, Marika, I'm not fetishizing process. It's something that I don't do very much. I must say that. I'm all interested in process in the sense that we have to do something to get where we want to get, but it's only in order to get where we want to get. So for me, the students have to do what they need to do to achieve what they want to achieve, but I don't have a mystery and alchemy of process. I don't. So
Morgan.
Kind of just I think I just wanted to maybe continue on what you're saying, like, if architecture is fiction making, what makes it different than painting, which is also creating a fiction? What makes it different than like writing a novel, which is also creating a fiction? I mean, so I think maybe what Marika's asking is, what is specific about the discipline and its type of fiction making?
Well, the thing is, we live in that fiction, unlike novel. I mean, we live in a novel while we read it, but here we live in a John Andrews fiction. I mean, it's not That's the thing. It's the ambiguity between fiction and real in architecture is very, very. It's So it's very interesting. Architecture is very interesting. It really builds the real thing, and it does organize. So, I mean, still think spatial criticism that's developed out of Foucault is very important, because we do create relations between people. We create divisions, we compartment space and all of that. So we do things that are very serious and very important in a way, which I think, we can always break walls. Walls can be broken, but I do think that it's the fact the way it inscribes in our lives, those fiction, is obviously fundamentally, and it's also the way it's distracted. It's a distracted relation to our lives. I think that makes very different than a novel, which is a deliberate construction. But I still believe the narrative, the novel as a model, I find that quite interesting.
Jason?
I guess going off of this interest in what you've termed as like the fiction of architecture, I was just reminded of something I was reading recently. The French name people, Mona Azouz on the French Revolution. Yes. And when she writes about the Revolutionary Festival, it almost becomes a sort of symbolic act that instantiates a sort of fact that already established. And when she points to the Revolutionary Festival, the problem that she would mark is this idea of fiction is like, where does this end then? Like, where does the kind of fiction that you're establishing, how does that end and get instantiated into something that actually has currency? And it seems that kind of brings to some degree what Michael was talking about when he was placing these 4 different modes of understanding architecture, whether through its formal operation, say like a symbolic operation, or a sort of essentially social function. And then he was sort of playing with what plays in between, and it seems that is where the question of the fiction or the purely symbolic meets and has to encounter the question of the contingent or the historically or socially contingent. And I guess I wonder, architecture understood as fiction still the idea that something that's being presented as fiction suggests that it's in something that's not the social or this real thing, and how do these two things necessarily have to come together?
Well, I would say that there's a gap between the two. A building can suggest a way of living, but it doesn't impose it on you. Mm-hmm. So we could be in an old Harvard building right now, and it would obviously have a whole tune about itself, when it creates strong fiction, and they're really, very serious things, these old buildings. But it doesn't mean that we have to take that on. I like the atmosphere and climate analogy where, if it's a sunny day in the morning, it may not change your entire day, and it's not going to determine what you do so much, unless you're going to the beach or not. But it accompanies you, and there's a gap, I think, between the fiction suggested by a building and the life that's lived with it. If there's no relationship at all, it's not very interesting.
I was wondering, listening to these past exchanges, if the problem is not that architecture is a matrix of possible narrative, but it's not one narrative.
Yeah.
And I think actually, when you begin when you want to write a fiction, you begin by doing some kind of plan.
Yeah.
And it's when it's not yet a novel or whatever, it's still a plan. And I think this is where architecture actually works, at that level of possible stories.
Yeah.
Michael, you wanted to say
Well,
something?
I was thinking that, to me, there was something between, it brings back Erica's historicism, historicity, and the other distinctions. There are moments when the desired object is never visualizable, it's never accessible, it's not actually even thinkable in a direct way, but there are moments when its substitutes become visualizable and visible, and I think the parliament is historicism because the object of desire is assumed to have substitutes which are visualizable. Yes. Okay, I think there are other moments, and maybe the Renaissance is a moment when the desired object of antiquity is actually visualizable as the orders, right? But think about then the Baroque. The Baroque still has geometries like the Renaissance of effect. They're thinking of Guarini more than Borromini, of Guarini's chapels, that they do have, the geometry does stuff, but there's also a geometry of affect, or a geometry that, when Leibniz talks about the entities in the world in terms of vibrations, that their relationships are vibrations or resonances rather than visible form. That seems to me a different modality of desire.
Yes.
That opens. I was thinking about the atmospheric.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was about to say. That it seems to me.
There's another modality that architecture doesn't, in its history, doesn't tend to use that much.
Yeah.
Because it prefers the visible. But there are other modalities where this object of desire can be indexed, let's say. I couldn't think of not represented so much as indexed.
It's always absent.
Yeah, but it's always absent. I don't quite know what I was doing with that. It's just, I think it's helpful to start to distinguish between historicism, historicity, which is more of a felt but non-visualizable effect of history. Yeah.
Can we just more simply, couldn't we just possibly call that history without historicism, in the sense that we're invoking, or reconstructing something from the past that does not also, at the same time, invoke the concept of style or periodization. And it seems, going back to the 18th Brumaire, that one of the other things that Marx and then Benjamin wrote about was the reconstruction of barricades, and that there were these entirely other series of things that were reconstructed that don't fit into the language of periodization or style that are still visual, but they recur, they're revolutionary, and they have obviously considerable consequences.
Let's say, don't forget that style is by the end a formidable fiction.
Yeah, but there's a very
there's no such deal as style outside of fiction.
Yeah. Just to pick up on what Martin said, there's this very interesting sign at the Occupy Oakland movement in Oakland, obviously, that said, you don't know where that is. That said Paris 1871, Oakland 2011, and 99% of the people that saw that sign had no idea what it meant, and it's obviously.
I wish they had better luck.
Yeah, that's
1871 did not end well.
One last little tidbit. In terms of Marika's question concerning process, I'd like to maybe just put two topics on the table. They come from literary studies, but I think they might be important in terms of how we rethink the problem of fiction architecture. There's a question of authority. There's a question of authority understood in all its magnitude, from authorship to what that entails in terms of responsibility and control over the product. And then there's also the issue of verisimilitude. Not all fictions are as enchanting as others, and different fictions resonate with different sorts. And so you also have to establish elective affinities between fictions and subjects.
That's a good point. Very good point. It's very curious. Thanks, Martin. You know, we were thinking about discussing about studio, and we ended up in fiction, which is, I think, an interesting. I was wondering whether one of the operativity of history is not also to delay the form-making process in some ways,
Yeah.
which might have to do with your atmosphere thing, which
Yeah.
is with the difficulty in a studio to manage, you know, the moment in which you have really to engage the form, and in some ways to
Yes.
find the proper mean to
Yes.
delay it,
Yeah.
so that, you know, it's not about solving a problem.
Yes.
And whether the operativity of history is not also, and all these kind of narrative function is
It's
not also
interesting.
to delay that, because once you're into the form, in some ways the story is already dying in some ways.
And in terms of process, Marika, I think that one thing that I tell my students is that they shouldn't rely on form to create atmosphere. That in some ways atmosphere and form are antithetical, so they do rather boring buildings and work on the sensational apparatus that can be generated from the very banal
But
box.
I wanted to ask
know.
Anita, perhaps, since we have a landscape representative here, you know, how would you position the same? Because it was very architectural what we say, and I was thinking, you know, landscape has a ton of relation with narrative, literature, etc. What's your reaction listening to this debate from a more landscape point of view?
Well, a couple of things. I was interested in I completely, I mean, we do make narratives, and of course we do imitate, and we imitate nature in its various representations, and because nature is always, we understand it in different ways, then the imitation always changes. So it's not as stable as it is perhaps in architecture, where a pyramid is recognizable. But I think the challenge in landscape is also that it is very hard sometimes to tell the representation of the actual thing. So, in other words, somebody looking at a landscape might easily confuse it and miss the fact that it is a construction. Because in the end it is made out of natural things like trees and things like that. So unless they know how the relationships have been shifted and reframed and edited down or contained in some way or another, they would actually miss it.
So the narrative would be, this is actually a constructed landscape.
Exactly, so the narrative is the narrative. But the thing that has gotten in the way recently of the self-conscious construction of that is this question of process, which is very problematic. And so it is problematic because if it is accepted uncritically, then landscape completely disappears as a social construction and as a cultural construction. And so I have started, in fact, just came back from a conference, the topic of which was landscapes in time, and I was trying to reverse the conversation. Why don't we talk about landscapes that have persisted for centuries, if not millennia? Do they exist? Why do they persist? How do they persist? And what changes around them, as opposed to always, in a way, fetishizing the process thing, which is dangerous in landscape, because then we lose the mark of social content.
But also the effective repertoire of landscape is of a different order, because it involves growth and maturation, which is a narrative in itself, which relates to human destiny. Then there's seasonality, and then there are the senses. We don't talk much about senses other than visual, but it should be there, because those are the subconscious realm that you are touching upon, particularly through scent.
Thank you, Mark. We have to remain pretty tight on the schedule because we have 3 speakers and 3 conversations. So I'm going now to pass to Eran and for the next presentation, and same format, we'll have a discussion afterwards.
Yeah, so just a minute to get ready.
Ah, bah, bien sûr, il y a un dead.
I like that.
Est-ce que tu veux un amateur de romans Okay, Eran?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Antoine, and thank you, Michael. And thanks, Marika, for organizing this meeting. Just following these two previous talks, so I hope to be able to bring some new topics, because I'm going to talk actually about design, culture, and history. And I think it's interesting because some of the things that have been brought up also in relation to architecture and to history as fiction is history as a commodity, which I think and the different currencies that history, once it's circulated, how it's being consumed and how it's being operated in different levels. So I hope I'll talk more about the design culture itself and how history is becoming is manifested through buildings. And I hope again both in the design studio and by architects. But I want to get rid of this strip down there. If anybody can help me with that. All right. So again, today's topic is, I'm going to read it, try to do it briefly to leave some time for discussion. So it's a big interest for me, today's topic, both because as a researcher, I'm on the one hand dealing with critical history, particularly post-war architecture, architectural representation, and the influence of science and technology on architecture from a historical standpoint. And on the other hand, I'm constantly investigating new digital design methods and the integration of history and theory into design culture in both architectural studio and the profession. So they will coincide today. And so I'm very glad to be here and hope to contribute. To problematize the question of the operativity of history and theory in architectural education and practice, I would like to refer to a particular historical event, the Holocaust, which many historians and intellectuals, including Zygmunt Bauman, Dominic Lacappa, Berlang, Saul Friedlander, and many other terms, an event at the limits, meaning event in our limits of comprehension and representation. I chose this reference because of the nature of the event as a case study for the operativity of history and architecture, but it also happens that today is the Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel, where the entire country joins to commemorate this tragic chapter in human history. I'll also refer probably during my talk to my upcoming book, as Antoine mentioned, Holocaust Presence, Shoah Representation in Architectural Culture. And I would like to start with a quote by the late American architect James Ingo Fried, who was partner with IMP and Henry Kopp, a Pei Kopp Fried and partner. And among his many distinguished works, Fried designed the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which I'm sure a lot of you know. So while devising this museum, Fried wrote eloquently, and I quote, I find it nearly impossible to deal creatively with a subject matter so heated. It is of course for me impossible to aestheticize it. I also find it impossible to reconstruct architecturally the world as it was in the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and further I found it not desirable, talking about desires, to attempt a purely scenographic approach with all its implication of kitsch and the devaluation and trivialization of the terrible and unexpected event. Of course, this quote has a lot of meanings, and one can unravel. But Fried, as you all know, completed the task and designed the museum while referring to historical artifacts and incidents that occurred during the Holocaust. And history became operative in his building through means of representation in the museum. Yet in this quote, Fried not only expresses the difficulties inherent in representing the Holocaust in and by architecture, but he also challenges the possibility of accomplishing this task at all. In other words, and for the sake of our discussion, the question of the ability to conduct historical representation may apply to any historical event, of course, and not only to one at the limits. Thus, to expand his claim, one may ask whether history can come into play at all within architecture or by architecture, that is explicitly or implicitly, is it possible to integrate history in architecture? I mean the build form. In a build form, whether it's specific events such as the Holocaust or any other event or historical idea or notion. And if it's possible, what should be the locus of history within architecture? To what extent should it prevail? After all, history, as you all know, is a human construct. As Walter Benjamin argued in his seminal essay on the concept of history, or some people translate this essay, thesis on the philosophy of history. So we define it, and I quote again, the true picture of the past flits by, whizzes by. The past can seizes only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. Here, referring to Paul Klee 1920s watercolor painting Angelus Novus, and proposing that the image is a depiction of the angel of history, Benjamin not only illustrated the fragility of historical narratives, but also alluded to their political nature. History is written reflecting a certain point of view, usually that of the dominant power, the ruler, by Benjamin. So the question is how history as a human construct with political implications should become operative in architecture. And following this insight between Benjamin and Fried, I would like to suggest two approaches to the function of history in architecture, both for the architectural profession and architectural education. The first one would be architecture as history, and the second one, history as a means of validating architecture, which I think started to come up during the two previous talks and in the discussion. But let me start with the first one, architecture as history. This concept can be rendered in two ways. One of these ways is when architecture becomes a historical case in and of itself. In these cases, architectural icons become part of architectural history and sometimes of the general history too. One may consider even relatively trivial examples such as my property, which is trivial, Korb Villa Savoy Poissy, Miss Neue Stadtgalerie in Berlin, Walter Gropius building in Dessau, or any other architectural icon, modern or otherwise, to reflect on the ways in which architecture becomes history. Even if they were not usually planned to function as architectural icons, these buildings carry not some significance that singles them out as part of a specific historical narrative. I think the issue of what's in history and what's outside of history, I think, is also very important in that case. They become historical items in matter, space, and program to the extent that beyond their physicality, they become text. That is, to reiterate Derrida, they become textual in a way that posits them, this building, as open cases awaiting interpretation. The textual condition, I would like to argue, is necessary in order for a building to become an item in a historical narrative. It adds something, another layer which we can relate to a building, a layer that refers to our consciousness and not only to modes of building's experience, bodily or other. Historiography relies on this textual condition. It cannot function solely on the physical presence of a building without having the text as a signified condition at its disposal. It needs the text of a building in order to construct narrative. I would like to dwell on this idea a little bit longer. Associated with physicality of a architecture, architecture as text may be more open for interpretation, or the opposite. Some buildings do not allow multi-layered interpretation, rather than they dictate a specific reading. Rem Koolhaas, I love images of architects, the ways in which they pose to the camera. Here's in Jerusalem when we received the Pritzker Prize. So Rem Koolhaas in his Kunsthalle in Rotterdam is an example of a building that dictates a relatively narrow reading of interpretation. And this is also very interesting in Rem Koolhaas doing some kind of history. Nevertheless, he writes, I'm not a historian. So this operation of an architect who's doing history in buildings historian, I find it very interesting. So Wallace tells us exactly how we should read the building, and indeed the building itself does not provide many further possibilities. Here the building as a text function as a discursive practice. That is because it is not only the building itself that provides us with the direct means of to relate to its signification. The reference to Corb's ramp in Villa Savoie, or even to the modular, to the Miss Facade in the Neue Stadtgalerie, to Opus Bauhaus building in Dessau. They're all things that Collas dictates how we should perceive the building. But in this case, it's also Collas himself who tells us in his book in SML Excel that how to read Kunsthaus. So if you missed it, as a non-historian, he will tell you how to read this kind of history. The dictated mode of architectural textuality often prevails also in the cases of conservation and preservation. When buildings reconstruction or preservation refers to its original plans and drawings, it will most likely create a similar mode of textuality with a strong resemblance to the one that emerged from the physical condition of the building when it was first built. And I think this issue of how ideas transforms from one building to another is also applicable here. I'm well aware of the issue of architectural signification as related to buildings conservation and preservation, to the fact that it's a complex matter. An interpretation of a reconstructed or preserved building is conducted from the present, as is the case with any history, which is by definition created from the present. Thus, one may argue that the reconstructed preserved building signification might be different than the one it carried when it was initially built, since the passage of time often changes, develop, or transform our understanding of a building. So I'm not proposing a counter-thesis for this notion. My only claim is that when a building is tightly related to its initial physical condition, its ability to create new modes of textuality is much more limited. The building does not benefit from the time that has passed and from our ability to reach new insights in relation to it. The other way in which architecture functions as history is in which buildings are deliberately constructed as historical text. And this is partly refers to what Collas was doing, but I just want to return here to the Holocaust Museum, and indeed any historical museum fall into this category. Here, history is being narrativized by architectural means. Again, to return to Fried, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, he reflected history using architectural elements related to the event. This is to watchtowers, to street lights, to bricks, and many more. And in this fashion, created a historical narrative, an isolated representation of a historical case within the daily urban fabric of Washington, D.C.'s mall. And this might be the case where we can start talking about dialectics between the daily and the historical. Indeed, the level of interpretation of the cited history, the ways in which history has been organized as a narrative and is being unfolded by the users as they progress through the building, is free and sometimes even random. Yet this building relies on the textual mode of architecture to create a narrative, and again, even if it's loosely formulated. Thus, even if architecture fails to be an accurate architectural text, its function is still valid. That is because in these cases, it mostly functions to create, and I use this term very carefully, to create an atmosphere of the past, even if the means to create the atmosphere seems completely ahistorical. For instance, look at Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin. Yet, whether being used to illustrate history in an accurate manner or as a free interpretation, architecture mediates history as text into this context. And I would like now to turn the discussion to my second point, history as a means of validating architecture. We often see architects that refer to history, and this is again the issue of history as commodity, to justify and validate their projects, their work. This tendency is more common among students who have to rationalize their design concept and articulation. After all, as relative newcomers to the discipline, they cannot invent architecture from scratch, or at least they cannot pretend they do so, as some architects do. Thus, it was quite common in students' architecture projects to find references to various histories, perhaps to the history of the site and context in which the project is being developed. Project might, however, also refer to the history of the architectural typology they address. In order to devise the next step of architectural typology, one must first address the typology's predecessors. Let me give you a short example, and just brush through these examples to make it short. In a workshop that Gregson gave to students in our school, he presented the hypostyle structure as a case study this is the hypostyle structure from Karnak in Egypt, for the reconsideration using digital design methods. This is a depiction of the hypostyle structure by James Henry Breasted, an American archaeologist from 1914, and another one which I find very beautiful by David Roberts. This is from a little bit earlier, from the mid-19th century. He was a British painter. So to help them generate ideas for digital design and of these architectural forms, students were asked to study structures, history, and come up with new possibilities about the ways in which they could be rethought by today's means of design. And the results were spectacular. I'll just show you. This is one of the proposals by a group of students that proposed to construct a hypostyle bridge, the beach of Tel Aviv. They used digital software, Rhino and Grasshopper, and actually trying to understand historically how the initial structure was constructed, and find something that would be similar, also using, of course, contemporary means of design and techniques like desalination of the water to introduce some water systems into the structure. And in the end, it was supposed to be located on the beach at Tel Aviv, which I think would be nice. Another one was in one of the boulevards in Tel Aviv. They also, you see, they took the initial idea and then manipulated it formally to create this kind of surface-like hypostyle. And their idea was to create something similar to Fontana di Trevi, also in Center Tel Aviv, also while introducing water into it. So, I think, yeah. So, but this is not only the case with student projects. Going back to history in order to validate or to rethink one's project, one may find it even in the work of such well-known architects as Frank Gehry and Greg Lynn. With Gehry, the supposed invention of neoformalism was related to by some historians, Francesco Belcon, Kurt Foster, and others, to Francesco Borromini. Here in the reference to Borromini, two projects of Borromini, just to rationalize the designs of Gehry. Lynn also referred to the Baroque, which is a heavy take on Gilles Deleuze's idea of the fold. As you know, he addressed architectural modernity and its curvilinear form through the reference to the work of Friedrich Kistler, and to the Endless House on the formal side, and to Vickover, as we saw earlier in Michael's presentation, on the theoretical side. So, and I specifically refer to these two digital architects to show that even in what might seem to be at the forefront of architectural innovation, history still plays a major role. As we all know, the word origin and originality stem from the same Latin root, origio, which is conjugation of which is a conjugation of the verb oraio, meaning to rise, and originality is defined as the source of or case from which something arises. So even if something looks avant-garde So originality or in origin are issues of return and repetition, just to echo Martin. So even if something looks avant-garde, reflecting supposedly historical or anti-historical practices, its root is firmly sunk in history and textuality of history. Often attacked for the work theory, and even more so, lean thought justification in a historical model for their architecture, even though proposing new ideas. They had to relate it to history. And I want to conclude with just a small case, because as I said, I want to show some things that I'm doing also in my studio where I teach. So unlike many, where I teach digital design studio, unlike many digital design studios all over the world, students that refer to biological models, to system theories, parametric designs, and so forth, or any other scientific or pseudo-scientific models. In my studio, we develop digital design methods by referring to history. Last year, we conducted a studio in Berlin. We visited there for 10 days, and the students were asked to come up with designs for buildings that, or sites that were built by the Nazis and are still intact. The Germans do not really know what should be done with these buildings and sites, how to relate to their historical significance on the one hand, or of course they do not want to monumentalize them, but on the other hand they cannot simply leave them as is or demolish them. So the students had to come up with ideas for possible solutions using digital design methods. The sites they studied included the magnificent Tempelhof Messe, an airport that was built as part of Adolf Hitler's grandiose plan for Berlin, for Germania. The Air Ministry building, the Luftwaffe building, which was built to serve as their headquarters, and today is the German Finance Ministry. The buried site where Hitler's bunker used, and he eventually committed suicide. In the right chancellery, a building that was demolished by the Russians as they entered the city. So referring to history, they had to come up with ideas about how digital design could be applied for these cases. I'll show one particular example of a student, his name is Tom, who dealt with the absence of the swastika from contemporary Berlin cityscape. In Germany, it is forbidden by law to present a swastika publicly. And for Tom, it was an erasure of history, and referring to the risk of infographics or infospace, he proposed to return the symbol to Berlin and to make it simultaneously absent and present. This is kind of tricky, or that's right. And he noticed throughout the city many ways in which the past was erased, from the buildings. So history can be present in buildings, or it can be erased from the buildings. And try to reveal, to see, this is from the National Geographic from 1937, how the city was completely saturated with this symbol in the cityscape. And then he went to study a little bit about branded spaces. As you can see here, this is all made from wood. When Hitler marched through Unter den Linden, they just put these columns up, and he proposed a gradient way to make the symbol present again in Berlin by means more physical, more virtual means of presence. Develop also kind of a parametric logic into it, just that the sign would be present and absent, and also manipulate a little bit, just need to make it, to rub it into the Germans' faces, tested the materiality, and came up with ornamental landscape in few different sites. I'll just skim it very briefly. This is the Unter den Linden, where these supposedly three structures are all constructed from, just go back, from the swastika, from this manipulation pattern of the swastika, or a bridge that was supposed to bridge bridge over the river, the Spree, and the last one was in where the Luftwaffe building was. This is from a Brad Pitt movie, where you cannot see these kind of things unless it's for movies today in Germany. This was supposed to be kind of a canopy over the road that's supposed to be for this. Okay, so to conclude this presentation, I hope this issue of how history is coming into play within in buildings. I find it interesting, and what I was trying to say is that architecture meanders between its role as a historical text and its search for justification in history. And even if contemporary practices try to present themselves as historical, at the end, this story is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eran. Can we have the light again, perhaps, so that we forget a little bit about the Svatiska? I wanted to ask Eve what would be your reaction. I know, I want to wake you up. No, because I was thinking something very specific, which is erasure and return. Because you work so much about this question about Eastern European, more about the post-communist transition, but because in some ways it encodes some of the thing I had heard from you, about the way you get rid of history, it comes back, etc. So what would be your reaction?
Well, it's a, as you know, it's a very current issue, or it's a recurring issue in Berlin, of what history to acknowledge and how to deal with the past in some kind of way. And I've always found that in Berlin, there's a great deal of history and consciousness of history, but a lack of, or a rejection of the notion of tradition, actually, which is a kind of persistence of history. And that you learn from history and you move on, because, and that there's a kind of dealing with it. And now, of course, it's a major issue. But one of the things that we discovered in doing research in the post-socialist environment is a concept that seems to have been instrumentalized and one of the, I should preface this by saying that one of the interesting things that we discovered, for instance, in the city of Zagreb, is that there's very little representational sculpture, actually, because sort of monumentality in that way, or monuments, because of the whole shifting of power, and that architecture was used. And the great thing about architecture is that it can be reused. And this notion of what was called cultural recycling, which is a very current one in many of these post-socialist environments, that things happen. There are many political changes, regime changes, and the wonderful thing about architecture is that it can be reprogrammed. And in Berlin is just a hypercase of that. And at the same time, the issue is always what do you acknowledge? And I think one of the most interesting sort of memorial sites in Berlin is that place called the Topography of Terror, yes, where it's interesting that yes, the Gestapo was there and there were prisoners held there, but the wall also went there. So when you're at the museum, there are just these layers of history, and that one way of dealing with this is by layering it, and having many layers, and understanding that these things, that history is layered, and that one is adding another layer to it, but that it's there.
Which is a kind of anti-Washington in some ways, in which I was thinking also listening to you that a lot of things that you say revolve around the question of authority by the end. For example, what happens? What is the authority of this historical text versus what Rem Koolhaas or Le Corbusier have to say about architecture, and how do they position? For me, it really struck me that a lot of things you say revolve about authority, about power, ending with the Berlin question, about the counterpower of architecture to, in a way, almost ironically, with this kind of irony of to bring back the swastika, etc. So power, counterpower, authority, the denial of authority, and I had not thought, when we thought about this session, it's true that the question of, what's the authority of the historical text? What does an historian do? I very often say that we're the undertaker of architecture, but which is true. We come usually last and we bury the architect, which is the great prerogative of the historian. But the architect may want to be buried in such, in some ways, is Koulas writing his will when he's telling us how to read the Rotterdam building?
I'm not sure about Koulas. Well, I don't want to relate to Koulas himself specifically and to this building, but I think another issue that I think is important to address here is what is the mode of historical expression? What is a historical utterance in a way? Because for me, Gideon, might write history, or might seems to be history, but he's an architect. He's not doing history. I think his heart is not in history. His heart is in architecture, and as a discipline, as a practice, I think it's something completely different. And therefore, he's closer, of course, to Korb and Koulas in this fashion, rather than to historians that are trying to do history from, as Michael suggested, it might be content of a content or some other forms of history making. And therefore, what's interesting for me is the ways in which history is being manifested by different means. And buildings are, have different modes of history. They're not, of course, they're as I said, being textual, but also they're operative as history by other means. So that was my point.
Yes, Peter?
It has struck me so far how we're dealing with largely issues of authorship, but I think not just in this past session, but in the prior one, in terms of the discussion of writing fiction and making this literary analogy. And in a way I want to perhaps evoke Barth's Death of the Author, and the sort of post-structuralist turn and the reconsideration of the text as actually something that has multiple meanings that are actually projected by us, the viewers. I'm wondering, in say this case of Berlin, is there any consideration for the sort of perception of this this graphic symbol? It seems so much a sort of singular authorial thing that becomes so abstracted that it is sort of meaningless unless you are the author and you understand that. Where do you see the viewer who is not in this sort of backstory sort of intervening in there, or are they not supposed to?
Well, it depends. The mechanisms of introducing this kind of design is, of course, much more complex. At first, I don't think it would be ever acceptable by the Germans. There was kind of provocation, and actually, this work, the studio was sponsored by the Germans, by a German foundation that tries to bridge, the two cultures, and they were very interested by this work. On the other hand, but they also said it wouldn't be possible to erect something like that in Berlin. Definitely
You're
today.
surprising me.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't know how to answer your question. It might be a bad design. This might be the quick fix for your question. But the issue of readership, the author is dead, the reader is dead. So I'm not sure. It's when you do something like that, if we would have been able to do this kind of thing, I'm sure it would get much publicity. Then the object won't be for itself. It will have some kind of discussion or discourse around it that people wouldn't be able to perceive it simplistically.
Michael, and then...
Well, this is just to append to that quickly. This is why I would urge that when we think about the conditions we're writing about or interpreting, that we not just think in terms of author or viewer, but rather of a sort of situation, a structural situation, where these individuals, as I said before, are actually just effects, and that And if we could construct that situation as some kind of contradiction, I mean, if you think of the contradiction of Rotterdam or the Netherlands, or the situation that Koolhaas is in at the museum, of being something like all we have left is fragments, and yet Koolhaas, there's this tendency to totalize. So how do you resolve fragmentation and totalization, or how do you resolve the desire and the necessity of invention versus a feeling in the early 90s that nothing new can be invented? And then the building becomes a resolution of a contradiction. We can't go on, we must go on, we can't invent, so we crib, but we crib in such a way that it still totalizes, right? And then like a contradiction is something about which, as Antoine was saying, about which multiple fictions can be written. That a contradiction is actually the first step toward representation. It's just, it gets the possibility of representing or of resolving going. So you start, if you forget the viewer and the author and think about situation, it seems then something more plural can be.
You're still a very Marxist person.
Well, I'm
Like
a
that.
historian.
Yeah.
I'm an architect and designer, and also involved in the digital age, and I'm very interested to understand, and currently writing a book about the history of the present in digital age. So I think that the operativity of history of the past has a meaning when we bring it into the history of the present. And I think, Michael, you suggested an operative tool in order to make history operative, which is very interesting. And I'm trying to put my thought into the framework, conceptual frameworks that you have presented before. And maybe back to Eran, who demonstrated a building that was telling about the past was telling us about event, like the building of the Holocaust was telling about the Holocaust as event, while in your case, the building were telling us about ideology. I mean, it was form, content, then the next level was theory, the next level was ideology. So if I look at the digital age, which is only 10, 15 years old, and in this period there are so many transitions, cultural, social, technological transitions, that it can be studied almost as a microcosmos. And I am trying to compare kind of the concepts that we hear along history, along the Gothic, the Baroque, etc., which related to form and geometry, and I'm trying to play with the concept of the digital age. So I think a concept like intricacy, that was suggested by Greg Lynn, for example, is very interesting, because I think it's contradict perspective. You know, intricacy has a very strong content, which you can observe because you look at much smaller scale, the scale of material, the scale not of the nano yet, but will be with the nano. And perspective is dealing with completely a different scale that come from the historical period. If I look at patterns, if we look at materiality as a way or to express, in your lecture, for example, the ornament, which is expressed today by materiality instead of figurative, of the figuration. So you compare materiality to figuration and you learn about technology. And if you look at materiality and figuration, figurative was expressed by drawing. Materiality today is expressed by printing the material. You don't draw. You make coding, you code the structure, you don't draw. So we see a complete change, but we understand this change by reflecting back to history and by making this comparison, which is very, very interesting. And I thought that the symposium, the ornament was fascinating in this respect. And I hope we can add more.
Okay. Well, it was almost 3 days, so we need some rest. Timothy asked, and then Ali Key.
I wanted to ask if you could maybe, Michael and Eran and Martin as well, return to the possibility of
content of content as something that I think, I'm assuming, Michael, because it came first in your list, is probably was positioned there to be the least viable for an effective operative history. And then following that through the second two presentations, and particularly in Eran's, where we run up against the unrepresentable, and the idea of form trying to deal with the unrepresentable, it seems that form, then to talk about the content of form, you can talk about its content being simply the unknowable, the unrepresentable. But I wonder if in those kind of situations, is there a path to be taken then through the content of content, through the descriptive performance, where architecture is not taken, as it seemingly inevitably is in architectural history, as the center of our focus, but is actually something seen only through a peripheral vision. And I mentioned, or I'd ask you as well, Martin, because I thought in the Houses of Parliament, what's very interesting about that example is that, to my mind, it's a building that does not make sense. So we can't read it as an object. A building makes sense, but it is a building that is attempting to make sense of a situation. That it's a part of a longer situation, a longer moment that began when the Parliament burned down, and there was a multi-year effort to make sense of it burning down, with hearing after hearing and analysis after analysis of why that happened. Why was the form destroyed? Who was responsible? And that the building and the collision of Fujian and Barry and the kind of endless hearings to build the building are also a kind of process, if we think of them architecturally, a process of making sense of something. So whether we'd want to build that from a building of the form, of the unrepresentable form, the form of the unrepresentable in the Holocaust Museum, or the more theoretical level, I would speculate that there is actually something in content of content as a historical method in which we have to give up the idea that architecture is front and center, but the architecture is nevertheless visible, and very strongly visible within that process. But that's a speculation, so I'm curious to know if that's tenable.
So architecture, would it be fair to say that architecture then would become part of content rather than a mediator between content and form? That would be some way of thinking that, no? That the content, there's something like, I was thinking of content as something like some unmediated real world that is not possible, but that would be the content, if one could get to it. And the content of that content, I mean, I think there's something very close in Eran's presentation of the content of content would still have a kind of rawness, a kind of unfigured, uncoded, uncoded dimension. But it would almost be to me, content of content is like, doesn't have a mediator yet.
But I think that, so maybe the speculation is that the very act of description there of the content of content, we have to understand that as figural in itself. And it may be what you were calling narrative, the three of you are calling narrative in different forms, that the content of content is still an act, it's a performance of description, of sorting, in the way that the historical chronicle is content of content, right? A list of the wheat, there was no wheat this year, the next year the king died, and so on. It's that list, but still that has a temporality, it has a scale, it becomes a signifying act as description. So maybe that's what there's a rawness, but the act, the historical work is describing.
Would be history as cinema verite or something.
Yes, as far as I can relate to this, I think that for me is, and I think it also comes across in these projects, especially the students one, is that form can only have content once it relates to the past. Otherwise we cannot rationalize it. And even if it's kind of a delayed past that would come after in the future, all kind of avant-garde practices are trying to do to create something that is not rational immediately, but
do not abuse of Benjaminian substances.
But so this would be my take on that. But I think this is the latency of content. I think this is something which can be very interesting and very important in creating all kind of social networks and social understandings about specific form. So if form is some kind of data and content is the information, and then one has to negotiate between the two. And I think the issue of codification is very important. Things do not have to be 100% rational in a way. They should be open, as far as I can see.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying about the Parliament building, which is something I want to do more work on. But the one fascinating aspect of the project was the actual drawings that were produced by Putin and Barry, and it's hard to know exactly who did them. We think Putin did them, but because they were very atmospheric drawings. Actually, I'll show that tomorrow in my talk, where they actually are deliberately caught in the fog. So it's very interesting how the architect would represent the building as dissolving itself. I'm also very interested in knowing that Monet went to London specifically to paint in the fog, of course, again, the London Parliament building. So that the London Parliament building, in terms of its actual vibration, coming back to Michael's comment about atmosphere and vibration, seems to be so self-aware that it wants to, it vibrates. It really is a thing that, just the intricacies of it, maybe coming back to what you were saying, it just seems to want to dissolve. You know, so I think there's a very strong, powerful thing about architecture being not there. Like, architecture right now is not really here, but it's here, and I think that's really powerful. I think it has this kind of sub-character. So, in that sense, it's much more powerful that it's because it's pervasive and subliminal in some ways. So I don't know. I'm not answering your question really, but I think there's some layers of things.
I'm going to take a last question about Aliki, and then we'll do something very dangerous in this kind of event, which is to take a break for 10 minutes, because we're human, but this is of course very dangerous. So Aliki.
I'd like to bring the focus momentarily back to the relationship between time and desire. And in your discussion, Eran, when you were talking about the project of preservation, and you spoke about the condition where a project or built work may be too close to its original context, and therefore the possibilities for textuality are diminished. And what you said that really snagged my attention was that the building then doesn't benefit from time. And so I admit I didn't hear what you said immediately after that, because I spiraled off into my own reflections about, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean that in time's passage there are accumulations, accretions, cycles of decay and erosion and whatever, that all of this is about, well, of course this is, you know, but this is all signals opportunities, and that therefore the more time that separates us from the original, the building in its original context, the better. I mean, I'm extrapolating, possibly. And I mean, in that comment, and admittedly, I could be focusing the microscope on something that was a throwaway comment, but that you have is there an essentialist or in fact an anti-essentialist position vis-a-vis that moment? And how can that be put into conversation with Martin's comments about the desire for that primal condition, right? But which is also not entirely retrievable, but it's an aspiration, and as per the definition of longing, I mean, there always has to be that distance, because the minute it is fully satisfied, it no longer exists. Right. So there always has to be that parallel tension.
Well, you have to understand that I come from a city where 1,600 buildings are under law of preservation by UNESCO as the international style city, the white city. And what happens often that you see buildings there that are being preserved, and they go into details, and they get the same aggregate from they go over Turkey and over wherever people brought their materials from in the region, just to reconstruct the building as it was. And then when it's finished, you enter the building and you feel that the building is dead. There's no sense in the building, and this is what I meant. That one has to building. I mean, this gentleman that was sitting over there was talking about seasoning and architecture. Also, there's also weathering on buildings, right? So, and I think this is something, and I'm not talking only about materiality, because when you go into the building and you don't feel that you feel the building is dead, of course one thing has to do with the material that doesn't age. So on the one hand, but it's more than that, that I think that a building gets a more even not formally or materially, it gets some more notions or more layers as time progresses, and this is completely gone. That was my point.
Thank you very much. So we're going to take a break of 10 minutes, but really 10 minutes because I'm a time obsessional, and so be aware. Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah, it's doing very well.
Okay. I just have a few images to show. But I'd like to sketch out two seemingly distinct features of the contemporary architectural mind, both of which can be understood as instrumental dimensions of our present condition. And I'll finish by discussing the consequences of those two features. So first, this image, which appears specific but is in fact exceedingly generic. It was produced in the early 1970s and it marks one of the earliest expressions of certain instrumental arrangements crucial to the emergence of a fully automated electronic control surface. Described in a technical report at that time as a, quote, statistical representation of the continuous surface of the ground, we can now recognize it as the instrumental precursor to an entire suite of technologies whose dominance within our field is assured. Which is to say, we are undoubtedly perched on the precipice of a full disciplinary immersion in a family of instruments whose principal aim is to unify and integrate hugely disparate data sets, ranging from cost and risk analyses to biometric and structural information. What's more, this integration will almost inevitably take place algorithmically, which is to say automatically. These instruments are predicated on the establishment of an electrical reciprocity, in which the concept of environment is defined exclusively as that which can be represented as information in the form of discrete electrical signals. In them, mathematical analysis and the concept of nature do not so much correspond as they merge indistinguishably. Though they take many forms, ranging from landscape monitoring systems to building information management software, these instruments ultimately lean upon the thoroughly positivist metaphysics of the environmental and ecological sciences, which reassert in their conceptual objects the myth of an objective and naturalized nature. Architects have taken virtually no interest in understanding these objects beyond mere technical acumen, instead summoning them for use value alone. I've spent some time now looking at the almost numbingly mundane details of their production, and I can report that they are not what they appear to be. They do not contain stable or immutable facts regarding our environmental conditions, and they certainly do not reveal causal relationships around which we might fashion design methodologies commensurate with our condition. So here then is the first instrumental dimension, which belongs to the specific equipmental arrangement of contemporary practice. It amounts to a kind of servile lusting after the products of the environmental technosciences, products that architects and urbanists know virtually nothing about, but which are rapidly reorganizing our pursuits around a managerial posture whose practical results are, historically speaking, questionable at best. This managerial logic, which reduces the rich mystery of existence down to a set of problems to be solved, conveys a style of reasoning that the design disciplines, in their present quandary, find irrefutable and therefore utterly irresistible. Through our equipment, we internalize the manager's naive opportunism, which repels critique not by direct refutation, but simply through absorption, into a relentless teenage patriarch smile. A confidence without subtlety or fear, which once motivated dreams and ideals, but now swallows and digests them in silence. Our fascination with these practices and technical products has slipped over into a kind of intellectual eroticism without bounds, which today releases 1,001 positivist perversions throughout our schools and professions. Thermal energetic mappings, biological and ecological models, climatological and demographic data, etc. Certainly such information is not useless. Rather, it is simply far more complicated than it first appears. Once upon a time, these practices and their conceptual products were uncontroversially situated within the language of progress. It would require tremendous naivete to situate them there today. All of which raises a fundamental question: why our submission to a set of disciplines with no more demonstrable access to truth than our own? Why our obsession? Why our lusting? Where does it find its energy and its impulse? And that question brings us to this image. It's a photograph from 1946. It's one of the earliest known depictions of an event where we are all now familiar with, the open jury architectural examination, which in the post-war years came to replace the closed-door evaluations characteristic of the Beaux-Arts pedagogic model. We have exceedingly few historical accounts of this pedagogic shift, and those that we do have confine themselves to a vantage point from which they could not possibly discern its epistemic consequences. Linger for a moment on the student's face. Let's imagine that what we're seeing is not the sort of momentary surprise we see so regularly today, induced perhaps by the adolescent behavior of one's supposed mentors, but rather that what we are witness to in this image is a more generalized bewilderment, the sweeping shock associated with having been displaced from a state of non-discursive extensivity to a gridded field of necessarily reductive orality. An orality that suddenly and reflexively demands that all architectural intellection adhere to a form of reasoning that is at base juridical. If we step outside ourselves for a moment, can we grasp the significance of having so silently and neatly inverted the relationship between objects and words? In this moment, acts of making that previously went by the name architecture were suddenly transplanted to an institutional framework that took as its basis the American legal system, a system that in turn takes as its base a fundamentally positivist, evidentiary, and deductive view of truth. Within this psychology, discourse, now embryonically conceived as theory, is posited as a star witness at the trial of the architectural object. And the student architect is forced into the position of a falsely sincere barrister whose obligation is to defend an object, no matter its poverty or guilt. From within the womb of this seemingly mundane, even innocuous institutional rearrangement emerged a style of reasoning we now know as architectural theory. In other words, the 68 generation, which today we most closely associate
And knowing you're a Marxist is the process of Moscow. Moscow.
I was invited to start trouble. So. In other words, the 68 generation, which today we most closely associate with laying the foundations of architectural theory, was the first to be required to speak alongside their objects. This was not a feature of the Beaux-Arts pedagogic model, and it catalyzed a kind of unseen reversal within the architectural process that has carried with it a concomitant demand that words be used as external legitimizations for a form of aesthetic expression that had never before required justification. In short, the false tension between thinking and making we now face was actually set in motion nearly 5 decades ago, when the latter was made subservient to a very specific brand of the former, when a very specific mode of juridical oration was suddenly and forcefully injected into a process that had previously defined itself precisely by occupying a dimension of reality beyond the word. This mentality now dominates all of architectural education, and I've wondered since I was a student whether architectural theory is capable of shedding the legacy of instrumental logic from which it emerged. Or would it be better served, or would we be better served, to speak of the creation of a more generalized philosophy of design? Under present technological conditions, that form of philosophy carries within it the possibility of attaining the fecundity and richness that once belonged to the philosophies of language and life before they were eviscerated as living practices by Anglo-American analytical thought. The question is not a simple matter of semantics, as some would say, but rather of the historical baggage now carried by an entire image of thought, which reproduced itself for 2 generations through a set of enormously dynamic and productive arguments, but which has now been resituated in a field of technical and ethical conditions for which it has no language. And here the... Don't break the material.
He's making me futz.
Anglo-American practice.
And here the merging completes itself, because it is precisely in those technical and ethical demands that today produce the impulse for the specific forms of evidence that now proliferate within our schools and profession. What better foundation for one's legal case today than the irrefutable eyewitness accounts of instrumentation that by design make visible the invisible, that quantify and calculate by sight. And yet the fact that the jury finds such evidence compelling does not in any way guarantee a more compelling architectural object. An ongoing coalescing has taken place among two forms of instrumentalism, the positivist equimental and the juridical institutional. And within the frame of that process emerges a rather unusual historical object seen in this image. The anti-subjective subject known as the user. The user is an ontological platform that under previous forms of theoretical description would be called a subject type, but which now, for having been formed within a framework that denies such categories, requires a lengthier description. Which is to say, because it exists principally in relation to the interface, which my colleague John Harwood has so brilliantly excavated in his recent book, the user is formed within a technical apparatus designed specifically to evade and undercut the spatial and perceptual distinctions between subjects and objects that define enlightened reasoning. I will address this in more detail tomorrow, but for now suffice it to say that the interface doesn't have a subject because it isn't an object, it's an environment. Strung between the reductive metaphysics of the environmental technosciences and the deductive pragmatism of the American legal model, the architect as user cannot hope for more than a partial existence. This novel configuration of organs and hardware has displaced not simply the subject of architecture, but the entire myth of subjectivity to which acts of making had previously belonged. And yet, to be clear, the poverty of the user has nothing at all to do with its technological immersion per se, but rather with the simple fact that its enjoyment of that immersion is always already made subservient to the supposedly superior truth demands of our conjoined instrumentalisms. So my contention is that we do not know ourselves. We do not recognize the degree to which our thought is colonized in its deepest regions by instrumental processes whose features remain unknown to us. The degree to which our individuation is now predicated upon a pedagogy in which the incurable dull-wittedness of the technocrat merges with the analytic ennui of the paralegal. And so a depressing bad air now hangs in the corridors of architecture schools where objects are reduced to case files, subjective desire finds itself denuded within the depths of its disciplinary formation, and the full weight of scientific environmentalism bears down as if it were a cross we've all agreed to carry. We've made for ourselves a dismal science that in every instance demands of our ideas that they finalize themselves as solutions to problems, that they terminate, close themselves in, prove themselves, and eradicate from within themselves every last trace of poetic ambiguity. This condition not only intensifies our complicity with the modern myths of functionalism, but more dangerously it overexposes ourselves, our passions, our desires, and our capacity for delight to the frigid distancing of objectivity, which asserts superiority over those so-called subjective qualities despite its own historical contingency. Just as design has had to acknowledge its complicity in the aesthetics of warfare, we must now come to terms with an aesthetics of management, whose archive is no less beautiful or brutal. This task consists in examining the intimate psychohistorical relation of modern managerial scientific representation to that which is silently posited within it, the principle that life itself is best conceived not so much as the fragility of being, or the enigma of desire, or the rich mystery of existence, but instead merely as a function of the organization of matter. Who here has not seen 100 impoverished architectural objects that proclaim as their legitimacy precisely that organizational basis? Science, Nietzsche wrote, has not yet built its cyclopic buildings, but the time for that too will come. That time, it seems, has come. And alongside those debased objects suffused throughout them, we require a platform for rumination, a way of seeing, an orienting schema, or at least a primitive compass for preserving our insanity, for protecting our ecstatic will from the boredom of myopic clarity. The bastions of rationality in which the technical sciences used to operate are collapsing, but we must continue to live in them.
Thank you, John. That was nice. I'm not totally convinced on an historical standpoint, but
Because you're a positive.
it is. Because I'm a positivist.
Next book.
Okay. Michael, I wanted to propose to you an answer or a reaction instead of breaking the bottle. And then we'll open to the floor.
No,
Let me preface everything I said by, I should have prefaced everything I said.
You did some theory.
I know. That, all of that is said with obvious, I mean, it was obvious tremendous respect to architectural theory. Michael taught my first architectural theory class.
Don't be worried. Don't be worried.
I'm not trying to,
you cannot have a provocation.
Okay.
So, Michael.
Well, no, to me the most interesting moment was the image of standing, and of course one personalizes this, those of us who've been through it, of standing before your project, explaining. And as an undergraduate, I remember very distinctly always having a thesis for my project. I always had an argument. And so when he pinned that moment to the beginning of architectural theory, I think there's a lot in there that one needs to think through, and I just can't unpack that. But I had never thought about that being the beginning of architectural theory.
And without the relation to the legal, because what I found really also interesting, and this is where, by the way, I'm not so sure, because I'm wondering whether, because this is a worldwide evolution in France also, projects began to be public, but we wouldn't think of the legal. It really struck me, what about the relation between theory and a kind of legality, which is by the end the original theory. The theory of the art was actually legislation passed on an art.
Yeah, well, I'm sure Timothy will have something to say about this, but the one thing, the one thing that didn't, John, ring true is the conflation of positivism and post-68 theory, because my own understanding would be rather that I could see that there was a I could see that there was a kind of let's say that the opposition version of theory, which is motivated by a kind of structuralism that is directed toward the production of architecture. I do think that could degrade or devolve into a kind of positivist thing. But I think the next generation, if that's post-68, then that's one thing. But I think the sort of 80s, the mid-80s, early 90s generation of theorists were quite explicitly anti-positivist. So that's
let me just clarify. I don't think that architectural theory is positivist.
Yeah.
I think it emerged out of a resituation within a field of positivism that it had to respond to in somehow.
Yeah.
If I may just jump in, I'm wondering if actually the real thing is not the acriticality of critical theory, that in a way it's mobilized to justify, which is, in my opinion, the true problem in this affair, is that if we take this legal thing seriously, then actually critical theory is always an argument for, and not really critical.
But John, could you explain why?
It's going to be a difficult.
Why would you say that the legal system is positivist? In what sense?
Because the law is based on positive reasons.
To me,
well, maybe the French law, but the common law is
the common law is based also on positive reasons.
No, it's based on historical precedents, right? So it's based on a series of judgments.
Positive means facts.
Quite far from a positivist scientific point of view.
That probably.
And I would have to say that why would a debate over design, which
a 19th century historian should remember that positivist means based upon facts.
Yeah, well, and a form of presentation which has been, talked about a lot, in fact, as a model, right, of how things. The notion it's a dialogue that why would that be? I'm not sure if I understand that, but I'm very fascinated, as Michael said, by actually bringing that issue up.
Well,
and by the way, what is that picture? Can you?
This is here at the GSD.
Yeah. So that was under Harvard, under Gropius, or?
Yeah. This book. This is from a book that just came out. Was it Joan Ockman?
The decadence of the dress code.
It could be Ockman. Yeah. This is the big one.
Yeah, it's MIT Press. Yeah. This is from here.
It's 41. Did you say?
46. But if you do I haven't, like I said, that we have exceedingly few histories of this, and the ones that we do have tend to focus on something like identity politics, whether someone was being othered in this context, and power relations and things like that. They don't. I've not seen an epistemological account of this of any sort, and nor do I have any plans to write one. But
what about Don Sean's?
I'm not familiar with it. Maybe.
Okay, the reflective practitioner.
I wanted to open to the floor a little bit, Morgan.
Okay. I was wondering, your argument seems to be like architecture has gotten too technocratic. Let's go back to art to some extent.
No, that's not.
Well, okay, well, maybe you could unpack it a little bit.
Reductive.
Well, no, I mean, just for, it's
Recapitulation.
sort of like a one-liner kind of, but I was wondering whether the opposite response could be like, architecture is too much of a pseudoscience. Let's make it really a science or real engineering. And the reason I asked this is strangely because of a weird dinner conversation I had with one of my roommates who actually is an engineer.
Oh my God.
Oh my God, those evil people who want to like destroy our lives, right? And she mentions that sort of just like a general kind of plague in the country today is that nobody wants to be engineers, and largely it springs from a fear, a kind of popular fear that scientists and engineers are kind of like out to get us. And so, if on the one hand there's a question against kind of environmental technocratic thought, on the other hand, a sort of like conservative backlash is also that, oh, all of these climate scientists are just out to get us, and they're like fucking with our brains, you know, and like giving like, you know, so I'm just sort of like my
Okay, point taken.
point,
So-
you know what I mean? So like I mean, and I just kind of walking out in the lobby. I don't go out and say, oh, all of these designers want to be technocrats. I look out and say, all of these designers want to be artists, you know. So I don't.
Well, it's a bit more complicated.
It's a bit more complicated, but I just kind of want to turn into a black and white question to clarify things.
John.
I want to immediately not make it a black and white question, but maybe one way to respond is that we're living in the ruins of an engineering culture that we've been living in for hundreds of years now. So it's not that it certainly isn't. My aim isn't to demonize the sciences. Everyone in my family is a scientist. But it's just simply to say that
a lot of things become easier to understand now.
No,
you have to talk to that.
No. Now the point is that all of these kinds of images now have to be seen within the context. I mean, you can pick whatever. I mean, you can use Beck's theory of reflexive modernity if you want. It's a neat, tightly packaged one, but these are not unproblematic practices anymore. And it's not that they're good or bad, it's that they are no longer, as I said in the talk, you can no longer situate them within the language of progress, development, efficiency, control, comfort, convenience, competency, expertise. Those words are empty now, they're gone.
But I mean, for me, like sort of like one of the biggest problems today in this country, at least, is actually not those terms, but is like it's the lack of infrastructure, it's the lack of engineering expertise, and it's the lack of
saying is I didn't read it as a plea for. I think it's more a plea because I think we're all confronted to the rise of the saving the world attitude in design school. And I think it has more to do with that we're going to save the world and thanks to the objective method. And it's that's the way I understood you, more the acriticality in some ways today of the search for objective method. It's not a condemnation of trying to be objective, because I think it's always probably a good thing, but it's taking so naively that we're looking for the objective. Peter.
In trying to find what is anecdotal about your presentation, I think the word that stuck with me the most was delight. Delight as some sort of alternative. I just want to push back a little bit and know why you think, say, technocratic culture or objectivity can't be delightful. Because I know plenty of people who would say they can derive delight out of those systems. Engineers, but also architects. So is delight the antidote, or I don't know. I want to probe that word in your presentation.
Delightful. Delightful is the term.
I think. I mean, I don't want to bring it down to a level of subjective delight, where some people delight in certain things and other people delight in others. I think the general thrust of the point I was trying to make is simply that that when these instruments are conjoined to the jury as an instrument, I find that when my students generally design out of fear, which is to say they are always already surrounding their objects with defenses, with
wrapping.
They're always wrapping it, and to the point where the idea now precedes the object. And I don't know whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing. I just am pointing it out as a basic epistemological condition that I don't think we've really fully unpacked or acknowledged, because it's really, historically speaking, extremely recent.
You were a student of Sarah.
Yes, and others.
Because it reminds me very much of, which would be an interesting historical problem. Why are we having also these discourses on in a way, the incapacity we have to go back to the object, which is an interesting historical question. But Olga had a question from the back.
Actually, I was thinking about trying to problematicize a little bit the discourse on computation, digital culture, and architecture. I was surprised by your historical method in terms of for me, if there are two presentations that have an extreme, they're extreme, the binary opposites in their approach to history is yours and Michael's. In the sense that, for Michael, history is this, shadow, inaccessible thing. The building, this was also a big surprise for me, knowing Michael. For Michael, the building is accessible, but history is not. But for you, you made, all these claims about the first time we have a user, the first time we have, I felt that within your project, you were trying to find moments of the origins, but of the discourse you were investigating or examining, and I found the origins to be very recent, and in a way also leaving out other discourses that could implicate your discussion of positivism in the tool in relationship with earlier uses or discussions around architectural tools and methods and stuff like that. So why did you make this choice to present this as a very recent, it is a choice after all, to find this beginning to be very recent, you start from 1946 is your earliest mention and 1970 is the second one. And somebody else here, I'm sure, would find other beginnings much earlier on.
Well, I think that's true of any historical account. I mean, you can always find earlier beginnings of things.
Do we need to find beginnings? That's what I want to ask.
No, and I in none of these images were. I didn't claim any of them were the first of anything. I said they were early expressions of. So I'm never looking for the first of anything. But I do think that in order to do historical epistemology, you have to acknowledge that there are certain kinds of, whether you want to call them ruptures or shifts, it doesn't really matter, but the field of intelligibility within which things are situated does at times shift. It does at times get rearranged. And in my case, in a 15-minute talk, I study technology. And so that I'm concerned with how the field of intelligibility within which architectural objects and discourse unfolds, how that has been resituated technologically.
I was just wondering whether a longer perspective sometimes would not be useful, because I was thinking the idea that the arts are actually, the practice of the art is attributable, is a very old idea, that you judge. The artist is the person who is judged. And there is a whole history of that. And the role of theory as a judicial power in the arts is a very ancient, actually. So I was wondering, by the end, it's a brilliant idea, this passing judgment thing, but actually it's a very ancient thing, which did not begin with public pin-ups. And what if, by the end, it's not a good thing? Because after all, this is what characterized the arts, contrary to engineering. In engineering, you're never judged, like in the arts. It's right or it's wrong. The arts, you're judged.
I just want to follow that, or to expand that offer, maybe if we distinguish between architecture as a discipline with a very long history and an art, and design, which is a more, for me, a technique that architecture is constitutively involved with architecture, but they're two distinct things. And maybe maybe design, the design part of architecture recently has tended toward the positivist, both in method and in its interest in certain subject matters like ecological issues or like material issues. The sort of data-driven, user-driven, neo-empiricist design techniques. I think that feels right. But I think my understanding would be that architecture, though it constitutively involves design, actually deterritorializes design and starts to precisely and depositivize, if that's even a word, design. And that actually something more dialectical. I would admonish, as Adorno always did to Benjamin, right, when he wrote about technology, that he needed more dialectics in his theory of technology. You see what I'm getting at? Because there's something that feels very right about the critique, but that feel like there's something missing also. Yeah. The delight part is what made me think of that. Yeah.
I had Fallon and then perhaps John again.
So I was curious as to whether the actual process of adjudication in the kind of the critique is what is at issue here, or that process is self-referential, and that that the precedents against which you're being judged are contained by the architectural theory, and maybe some theories that have been posited as architectural theory by corporate management philosophy. And so if it is more about a solution here could be that we need to expand the metrics against which we are measuring this very objective presentation, or that we need to throw out the process of adjudication altogether.
The distinction I'm trying to make is actually maybe somewhat below that. That really what's at stake are two different kinds of language. One of which is discourse, which is, and I'm going to exclude something like poetics here, but the discourse is necessarily reductive. That is, it necessarily reduces the world down to make it comprehensible in certain ways. The contention I'm making is that the architectural object, at least prior to that, and this could be, we could argue about this, I don't know, but that to my mind, it was in a way, it was born of the great compromise of the primal scream, right? That it's always necessarily been beyond the word. The object has always necessarily been, in the same way that music has always necessarily been beyond the word. And so I don't know whether the 15-minute genealogy I just gave makes a difference or not, but I've always wondered about that reversal, and I've always wondered about the effect of that reversal, and in particular I'm concerned about the effect of that reversal in this contemporary moment when we are under particular ethical and technological pressures.
But do you really think that the object ever had that beyond? I guess I'm trying to understand what you mean by the beyond of it, because I get the beyond as beyond a certain kind of descriptive language, but not beyond a criteria of judgment.
Sure, and judgment can always run alongside it. The point is, it's very simple. It's why make architecture if you can just talk about it.
Well, I feel like there's the framework. So if I look at the legal span of this, and you're looking at a period when in 1800 the point of law was justice, and in 2000 the point of law is fairness, and that's why Obama was running on fairness. So justice to fairness is a pretty dramatic shift, right? And so the thing that precedes the object in this prior state that you're talking about is still justice or just metaphysics. So I guess what I'm asking is whether I should accuse you of kind of crypto metaphysics, but I think I know you well enough to know you're not a crypto metaphysician. but then is delight, and I have the same. I think that this question is well taken. That what is the thing that's coming in, the delight and so on. If it's not metaphysics, right? And is it a subjectivity? It's still the thing that precedes the object, right? That you want the object to still be protected by this other thing, by this other value in a way.
And I think that's where that's why I bring up the user, because I think that question is precisely where it gets incredibly difficult, because the user is as I said, it's almost an anti-subjective subject, and that's not a pejorative statement. It's simply an analysis of what happens when you set up the interface as an environment, and I think that is, for me, that's the kind of question that I would like to see, whether we call it architectural theory, whether we call it architectural history, whether we call it philosophy of design, or whatever it is. That those are the kinds of questions that they seem technological, and sometimes they almost teeter on technological determinism, but that they're willing to ask those kinds of questions, because to my mind, and this is what I was saying earlier, that this incredibly rich period of architectural theory that we clearly had from the 1960s forward, the reason I left to go to another discipline for my PhD was I didn't feel that we had the language anymore to have a sensible conversation about these kinds of issues.
A number of the meeting, we don't have the language for sensible conversation.
It's good to follow on that. I was wondering exactly what the relationship between instrumentalization, justification, judgment are that are going on here, because I mean, so you mentioned Anglo-American analytical philosophy. Knowledge for any of the people in this discipline is not just justification. It's JTB with Gettier problems and all these other things that are going to be worked into that. And the same way that I would think in more contemporary analytic philosophy, or continental philosophy, even from Heidegger on, truth is devalued. I mean, truth comes from untruth in Heidegger. Deleuze, truth is subjected to the power of the false. And I wonder if part of the issue would be that, so maybe theory does arise out of a culture of juries as an attempt to justify or explain, but I wonder if there's enough of a gap between the attempt to explain what you're doing and justify it or adjudicate it in some sort of way. That actually doesn't mean that we have to throw out, what theory was trying to accomplish, but maybe we just make sure we're clear about the goals of theory.
Well, yeah, I think boundaries would be important to establish, but I'm not sure I understand the.
Well, I guess my question would or maybe more of a statement, I guess, that if you want to say theory arises out of this culture of justification, I'm not sure if it needs to be reduced down to an issue of justification, to an issue of truth or falsity or something like that. That you don't have to toss out theory because it arises out of that culture. No. And you don't even have to say that what theory is trying to do is actually justify at this point.
No, and I think, hopefully this is coming through, that actually what I'm trying to talk about is the extension of the project of architectural theory.
Yeah, well, so, I think that makes sense, but you could say the contrast between these efforts and what even theory from Michael's point of view is pretty vast, what we're actually trying to accomplish. What an explanation, what constitutes an explanation, right? Of course. So we could say there's maybe issues at the origin of our contemporary theory and thinking about how it was part of an instrumental discourse. But I mean, you have philosophy from Heidegger on is worried about that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that philosophy is actually still going to have its problems of instrumentalization.
Yeah, there's no antidote.
Well, just to make a remark, and then, which is, I like positivism, I have to say. It's only, first of all, because positivism is, once again, about facts. And I remember we had a great conversation with Michael. Actually, as soon as you begin to ask yourself, and actually Auguste Comte was by no means a positivist in the usual sense, because actually when you begin to think what is a fact, and I think actually this is one of the most profound questions you can ask in a discipline. What is a fact for a discipline? Which is not exact. So actually I think in some ways that is not positivism for me. That's just cheap reassurance. And that's not positivism, because positivism is about constructing fact, because anyone who is a positivist knows that actually you construct facts. And I think actually, to go back to theory, for me the main problem very often in theory is that we're unable to say what we consider as a fact or not, and that's annoying. So, because you remember that conversation we had with Michael, and I think typically we agreed very much on the fact, on the idea that it's actually the most profound question you can ask. What is a fact? And let's be positivist for one. And I think it will be probably the last question, because we're really reaching an end. I know it's very frustrating, but we've been here for 3 hours.
We do have tomorrow.
Huh?
We do have tomorrow.
Yeah, and we still have tomorrow. Let me remind you before the last question that tomorrow we meet again, that time for the real thing, the Cambridge Talks, the annual PhD and doctoral degree more generally event. So we've got a question, not a long...
It's going to be long.
Huh? It's what?
Short, long.
No, short.
Okay. Two things.
You're really the last one, so short,
Okay,
it's more incisive.
I'll try.
Okay, good.
Two things I want to relate to the interface and how it relates to the judgment. So, interface. Do you use iPhone? Do you use iPad? It's all about interface. So, the more human the interface will be, the less we will notice it. So I think this will disappear. So it's not the interface. Google glasses, no interface. What you think is what you see.
I'm not
Okay, that's short. Another thing, judgmental. If you turn what you demonstrated is calculation, quantification of information for evaluation. If you turn the information quantification into a generative mode, if it helps you to generate ideas, then you get delight. So all you have to do is not to see it as evaluation means, which threatens, but turn it into a knowledge you know how to generate, which drive your generation process.
Perfect. So, John, you have the last word. And
oh, I do?
Yes, you do.
Maybe he doesn't want it. So I don't know what to say.
I know, that's embarrassing, isn't it? Come on.
The last word. I don't know how to respond. I guess I would just say that this was a speculative argument, and it's nice to hear it tested out by people and hear it discussed. That's all.
Thank you. So I would like to thank again all participants.